Good morning. I'm Michael Hansen, Senior Fellow and Director of the Brown Center on Education Policy here at the Brookings Institution. I welcome you today to join in our discussion on the future of school accountability under the Every Student Succeeds Act. We'll be archiving a video of today's event, so anyone who wishes to view after today may do so through the brookings.edu website. The Every Student Succeeds Act was passed in December of last year with bipartisan support. This is the most current reauthorization of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act and replaces the No Child Left Behind Act. No Child Left Behind's most distinctive feature, of course, was its mandate for states to administer standardized testing for all students in select grade and subjects, and then holding schools accountable for annual yearly progress toward proficiency on these tests. Due to the testing and accountability requirements under NCLB, it was generally considered the peak of federal oversight in our public schools. The new law, referred to as ESSA or ESSA, I'm not sure how the panelists will refer to it here, but it does not backtrack on the testing requirements of states. However, it is a major sea change on the school accountability side. Important changes to the federal law for school accountability systems include the following. Number one, no more requirements for adequate yearly progress in schools. Number two, no prescribed strategy specifying how or when states intervene in their lowest performing schools. And number three, a new requirement for states to include other measures of school performance and accountability systems that are not based on standardized tests. Of course, these are not the only changes, but these are some of the most notable ones. Combined, all of these changes are significant because they represent the return of a significant amount of autonomy to states regarding the design and the consequences of their state's accountability system for their schools. And so during today's panel, we will hear from these three experts who have a wealth of experience in working either with or for state education agencies as they have implemented school accountability under NCLB, and they will discuss how they expect this issue to play out in the coming years under the Every Student Succeeds Act. Our panelists, let me introduce them to you here. First, we have Arne Duncan on my far right, your far left. Arne Duncan, he is a non-resident senior fellow here in the Brown Center on Education Policy here at Brookings. Previously, he served as the U.S. Secretary of Education under President Obama for 7 years, and prior to that, he served as CEO in Chicago Public Schools. Currently, he is working in a new role as managing partner with the Emerson Collective. In the middle, we have Hansel Kang. Hansel Kang is the District of Columbia State Superintendent of Education. She has served in this role for a year and a half, and she came to D.C. from the state of Tennessee's Department of Education, where she served most recently as Chief of Staff and part of the team that helped districts in Tennessee implement policies and supported them as they became one of the fastest improving states in the country. Ms. Kang is also a former high school teacher. And finally here on closest to me is Chris Minnick. He is Executive Director of the Council of Chief State School Officers, CCSSO. Chris has worked in the Executive Director role since 2012, and as Executive Director, Chris has ushered in a new strategic plan in which CCSSO is committed to making sure all students participating in our public education system, regardless of background, graduate prepared for college, careers, and life. Arne Duncan will be moderating the conversation amongst the panel today, so I now turn the time over to you, Arne.
Thanks so much. I'm thrilled to be asking the questions rather than answering them. It's a much easier job. I like to play Oprah. And Chris has grilled me numerous times over the years, so I'm going to start with Chris and put him on the spot.
Yeah, thanks.
And look forward to having a conversation. We'll talk for a while amongst ourselves and open up to the audience and take any questions you might have on anything. So, Chris, maybe this is, sort of set the historical context a little bit. Walk me back, sort of pre-NCLB, what accountability was or wasn't for the nation.
Yeah.
What worked, what didn't with NCLB, and a little bit about what you think may work or may not work with the new law.
Yeah. Thanks, and I just want to thank Brookings for pulling this together, and Arne and Hansel for being part of this up here with me. The history is really interesting because I came into a state agency right at the beginning of No Child Left Behind, so that's when I have cardinal knowledge. But I will tell you, when I was in Oregon and I was in a state agency, we had very little information on how our schools were doing prior to No Child Left Behind. There were we had tests at maybe like three. I think it was grade 3, 5, and 8. We didn't even have a high school test at that point statewide. So we just didn't know how our schools were doing. We thought we were doing great, but we didn't have any information really. And so NCLB did a couple of important things. It gave us a whole lot of information on how schools were doing, and it forced us to disaggregate the data and show us our gaps, right? And that's just huge for the country, and it's something that we cannot overemphasize. It's in the current law, the new law, which is great. We cannot go back to a time where we don't have information on how schools are doing. And so, and I don't think we're going to, but I think that's a risk, and people are properly pushing us to think about how do we continue to provide good information back to teachers and students and parents. I also think one of the challenges of No Child Left Behind is, as state agencies, we weren't great communicators of that information. So we had a lot of information, but we didn't put that out in a way, this is a generalization, some states did better than others, but we didn't put it out in a way that parents could engage with, that teachers could engage with. So, 3 or 4 years into this and a school's not improving, a school would get a letter saying, you need to come up with a plan. You need to write a plan and send it in. And so the state would then approve that plan. But there was no real action on the other side of whether or not the plan was being implemented, whether there were resources to implement the plan. So it was largely an exercise in becoming transparent is how I would talk about No Child Left Behind. I think the ESSA opportunity is to go beyond transparency, to go into the idea that it's not enough just to tell a school that they're not getting it done for kids, but we've got to do a better job of helping that school actually get better. If you look at the statistics, the majority of schools that are in the low performing status in these states aren't approving fast enough. There are pockets of success, and we need to learn from them. But I think the success of this law really relies on whether or not we can help schools that haven't been getting it done for kids. I think we also have to understand there's a middle group of schools that may have big gaps, right? So they're getting it done for most of their kids, but there's a group of kids maybe that need some extra assistance. Those schools need to be focused on as well. So I think you see that framework in the law, but this is really going to be on the states to step up and do this. And that's what our organization's working on. I'm really proud of what DC is doing and other states, and I'll talk a little more later about which states I think are really doing a good job on this. But it's exciting to see the states have this opportunity. But I think people are right to question whether or not the states are going to step up, because that's on the states to decide if we're going to be able to do this, and that's what we're working to try to do. So.
And Hansel, again, before we sort of get into the nuts and bolts and the accountability stuff, DC is this amazing story of, I think probably most folks live here, but went from very dysfunctional, very corrupt, interestingly not underfunded, significant resources, but just not getting it done for kids. And while DC, by any measure, has a long way to go, I very proudly and loudly, repeatedly talked about DC being the fastest improving district in the nation, which is no small feat because it was. So give me a little bit of the 5 or 10 year sweep of where DC was, how you became the fastest improving district, and then I'm always interested in how do we keep that momentum going as we move forward.
Absolutely. So as you said, I think there's so much to be proud of in DC in terms of the progress that has been made over time. And I think what's really exciting about it is we've seen that progress in both DCPS, which is our traditional district that serves a little more than half of our students, and in our public charter schools, which serve just under half of our students. And to see that progress across sectors and driven by really different approaches and a range of approaches has been really exciting. We've seen sustained and significant progress on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP test. And we've seen that both on state level NAEP that assesses all of our schools and all of our students, and also on the TUDA assessment, Trial Urban District Assessment, which is specific to DCPS. And again, it's just a validation that that progress is really happening across the District of Columbia. At the same time, as you said, we know we have a really long way to go. We see significant and persistent gaps that exist among different groups of our students. And we also see that not enough of our students are on track for college and career readiness. On the first year of our PARC assessment, the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Career, which we released last fall, we saw that about a quarter of our students were on track for college and career readiness across grades and subjects. And that is not nearly enough. So we are excited about the progress we've made, but we know we still have a a really long way to go.
But take a minute and walk me through, because then I'm always interested not in absolute results, but in growth or gain or lack thereof. So for you guys to be the fastest improving district of large urban cities, it's a big N size. By definition, that means you guys are doing some things differently than other districts around the nation. So again, over the past X number of years, why do you think you are getting better faster than everybody else?
Absolutely. I think the expectations we have for our students and for our educators have changed dramatically in recent years. So I had the benefit in the 2010-11 and 11-12 school years of working in a role in DC where I was managing a team of instructional coaches who had teachers in both public charter schools and in DCPS schools. So I was spending a lot of time in classrooms during those years and got to see the work that was happening. And then I stepped away and went to Tennessee for 4 years, and coming back to the district now with the benefit of having just had that gap, I was able to really see and feel viscerally the different type of teaching we were aiming for, teaching and learning we were aiming for in our classroom. So I had the benefit of seeing the progress that's happened in DC, not just in our data, but actually in what I see in classrooms. So I see teachers and students aiming for something very different than they used to. I see people reading real texts in classrooms and writing about those real texts and talking with each other about those texts. In math classrooms, I see not just sort of rote drilling of problems, but really people aiming for conceptual understanding and problem solving in a different way. And I think the ways in which our LEAs, our local education agencies, have aimed for those different expectations, the approaches they've taken have varied. And I think that diversity and range of approaches is one of the strengths of DC, that we have 64 different LEAs that have tried 64 different things. But it's been very exciting to see that consistent raising of expectations across the board.
Yeah, Arne, can I get in on this? Because I'm hesitant to talk about the standards with you sitting here, but I do think that we raised standards across the country, and the states did that, and that was a big deal. Like, whether or not we think we're way past this conversation about higher standards, we aren't. Teachers are still learning these standards, and in states where they have internalized the idea that kids have these higher expectations, we are seeing different results. I think when I visit schools in DC, I see the teachers engaged in the standards in a different way than other places, that they know where they're going, they know their targets. And so, granted, all the politics around higher standards aside, we've changed the country's expectations by setting clear standards and going for them and helping our teachers get there. I don't think there's a better way to say it than we've set higher expectations and kids are starting to hit those expectations. So that, I think it's a huge thing.
And Chris, walk me through, and we'll get into nuts and bolts later on the assessment side, but when you sort of talk about schools not improving, that's largely minority schools around the nation,
Absolutely.
not exclusively.
Yeah.
When you talk about gaps, we're talking about racial gaps. And so I just want to put race out there front and center, because I think we can't have an honest conversation if we're not talking about those gaps. We also, as we know, have a set of largely white schools that are mediocre at best, that aren't knocking the ball out of the park. But as you think about all these things, how do you think about race? How do you talk about race? How are states able to deal with a very tough issue? But again, I think if we're not dealing with it, we're frankly not in the game.
No, that's right. Well, I mean, the first thing is for us to acknowledge that we haven't treated every school the same in states, and that we have under-resourced certain racial groups in a way that is irresponsible and also just not fair. So, and we have to own that as a country. And so as state leaders, we are having tougher conversations about, okay, so if a school really isn't getting it done for a group of kids, how do we lean in and change that? It may mean that we have to spend more money in a certain place than we have. It may mean that we need to try to invest in leadership. I see a lot of these schools when I'm traveling and visiting schools. The schools that turn around the fastest are the ones with leaders that are inspirational, and that's across racial groups. So we absolutely have to have the conversation, and I really appreciate what you're doing now, Arne. You didn't have to step up in Chicago, but that's one of the places, among others, that need to have a conversation about how race plays into those academic outcomes. And if we're not saying it, I think that's a huge problem. There's a lot of places that just still aren't talking about it. And so when I go into places and I bring it up, sometimes I get either people don't want to talk about it, or or they'll say, you're race baiting or whatever. And I think we can't have this conversation honestly unless we step up and say, this hasn't been fair and we've got to make it fair now. So that's how I'm talking about it.
And again, DC is largely a minority district, minority poor district. How do you guys here think about both race and class?
I think it's critically important that we're first just transparent and honest about where we are.
And give your demographics so people know.
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe we're about 80% African American across the district, and also have a significant and growing English language learner and immigrant population in the city, which are important needs as well. And so, sorry, I said 80. I think I meant 70.
70, yeah.
But yeah, I think it starts with, again, being honest and transparent. So when we released our first year of PARCC results, I mentioned that about a quarter of our students were on track for college and career readiness across the board. But the gaps that existed were incredibly stark, and it was important to us that we immediately followed up the overall results by also saying these are how particular groups of our students performed. In particular, we saw that on some grades and subjects, nearly 80% of our white students were already on track for college and career readiness, and only about 17% of our African American students were, and our Hispanic students had similar results. That gap is unbelievably stark, and we know that the bar for being on track for college and career readiness on the PARCC exam is a really high bar, and yet 80% of our white students across the city are there. And so how we support the rest of our students in getting to that place is deeply important to us. When we created a strategic plan at my agency, the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, the title of our plan is A Commitment to Equity, because that is our true focus. I think one of the things that DC has done that we can be really proud of is actually looking at the question of resources. So the City Council and the administration have made this commitment to providing additional funds to schools that serve our most struggling students. So it's called the At-Risk Formula in DC, and it's additional funding that schools get for students who are on SNAP or TANF benefits, who are homeless or in foster care, or who are in high school and overage and under credit. And that's really a true focus on delivering those resources to the schools that need it.
Arne, I just want to add one more thing. I just think equity cannot be defined as spending the same amount of money on every kid. We've got to overinvest in places that have traditionally not had the resources. We have to change fundamentally what's going on in those places. I'd like to hear about what you think about in Chicago as you're talking about this, if you'd be willing to share that.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm happy to. And Chris is
Mickey,
good at turning
Chris.
back on me.
Well, yeah, because we're not going to do all the talking here.
Well, just to say first, I couldn't agree more with Chris that this has to, whether the word is a weighted student formula or something, kids who have more needs, whether it's poverty, whether it's health issues, whether it's special needs, it takes more resources to educate them. So I agree. The challenge is we live in a nation where much of the funding is local property tax-based. And so the children of the wealthy get a lot more spent on them than the children of the poor. And it's fundamentally unfair and inequitable. And to be very personal, on the Chicago side, in Chicago, where our kids were 90% poor and 85% minority, we received less than half the funding each year of children who happen to live 5 miles north of us in Wilmette and Winnetka. You think about half the money for the kids who need the most over 13 years, K through 12. It's devastating. And we sued the state, we lost. But the system itself perpetuates inequality. It perpetuates the haves and the have-nots. And so how we do something different, I tend to be pretty radical in this stuff. One of my simple to articulate, hard to do is, what if teachers who were teaching, pick a number, in schools that were 50% poor, 75% poor, or 90% poor, what if they had a 50% bonus for teaching in those schools, and social workers and counselors? And I think every teaching job is hard. Some jobs are harder than others. And I think about social workers in a high school in Southside Chicago, Dunbar, where they had 4 kids shot and killed recently. That's a very different job for that social worker than a social worker in another school. Again, not that any of those jobs are easy, but until we start to overinvest, until we start to incentivize the hardest working, the most successful teachers and principals and counselors to work in disadvantaged communities, be it inner city, urban, or rural, or on Native American reservations where there's the largest gap, I don't think we're really serious about it. We're talking about it, but not quite doing it.
Agreed.
Take a minute, and DC is pretty unique. It's, for an urban district of being sort of basically 50% traditional, 50% charter. You have New Orleans that's 90% charter and a little bit the other, and there's not much in between there. that mix feel right, not feel right? Some ways it's more innovative, some ways it definitely complicates your life. How do you think about having a real, true portfolio here?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that's been really exciting is over the last 4 years, we've seen enrollment in DC schools as a whole go up, and we've seen that growth in enrollment in both sectors, both in DCPS and in the public charter schools. And so for a long time, that percentage of students who were enrolled in the two sectors was dynamic and shifting, and over the last 4 years, it's really stabilized close to that 50-50 mark. And I think that the executive director of our public charter school board and the board chair at the time wrote a piece in the Washington Post last year saying, sometimes people call for, should we be more like New Orleans in terms of the ratios? And they said they think that the balance we have right now is about right. And I think the most exciting thing is that our parents have choices and that there are two really vibrant sectors and a really wide range of schools for them to choose from.
Let's start to get into sort of the meat and potatoes of this. So Chris, walk me through, I agree with you totally. NCLB, focus on transparency, focus on disaggregating data. It was also a focus on a single test score. That was everything. And I think all of us can agree that was too much weight on one indicator. Going forward, how do you think about accountability systems that are more holistic, that are more comprehensive, but also are understandable, that you can communicate them and not be a wonderful thing in a black box that no one can talk about. So there's an opportunity, but a risk now. But walk me through sort of very concretely, is there more flexibility, more autonomy? What are you encouraging states to think about? What's the mix of indicators? And then how do we talk about these things publicly?
Yeah. Well, so before No Child Left Behind, we gave tests and they didn't have a whole lot of stakes attached to them. And nobody was concerned about over-testing and things like that. So I think there's a lesson to be learned there as states are thinking about other metrics. So things like student engagement metrics. Those things are, I've seen a lot of those surveys. Schools get a lot out of those things. So whether or not students are engaged in their own learning, there's questions about do they feel safe at school? Do they feel like they have an adult that cares about them at their school? Those are really important things. The question is, when you put them into an accountability system, do then the schools begin focusing on that so much that kids feel pressure to be engaged with an adult? These things have to happen organically, and I think we have to focus on them without putting too much pressure on them. So what does that lead me to? It leads me to proceeding with caution as we get into these new metrics. So thinking about what are the things that we want schools to really focus on? What do we value in our system? So states like Tennessee and New York, and there are others, but those are the two that I'm most familiar with, are engaged in their community about a conversation about what do they value in their schools first, before they even talk about the metrics. I think that's a really important thing to do. Because if you don't do that, you'll end up just picking a metric and putting accountability on it, and then all your schools will begin chasing it as the holy grail. We need engaged kids, and that's all we need. We don't care if they can read or write. We just need engaged kids. And so I think as we balance this, as we try to go away from a single test score, as you pointed out, Arne, we need to be sure that we aren't setting up another situation where we're going to come back in 5 years and say people are chasing a different metric that isn't helpful or isn't the only thing we want kids to focus on. So how do you do that? I think you pick a few metrics that could either independently be reported or reported as you roll up into an index, right? And so I think there are pluses and minuses to both of those systems. As an aside, I'll probably get the question about the single metric at some point. I'm happy to answer that. But I do think there are ways to do it, either with a single metric or clearly reporting out like 4 categories, right? So academic proficiency, academic growth, and high school graduation rates, maybe career readiness, whether or not kids are getting certificates in a career field, some type of safety engagement metric. I mean, those are the types of things that we're seeing and the types of things we're advising on. I'd really hope that a state doesn't end up with 15 or 20 metrics. I think that'd be very hard to communicate to parents. I think also, if everything matters, then nothing matters. So we've seen that in accountability system design. So all that, Arne, to say, I think a few clear metrics I think are really important for any state's accountability system. And also thinking more about how you're going to communicate this than the actual metrics. If you go state by state, the bottom 5% in most states are the bottom 5% in almost any metric. If I was sitting in a state, I might even consider just using test scores for the bottom 5%, because you want to know what? The more you add to it, it doesn't really matter, because you aren't differentiating at all between those schools. But I think it's really important, the signaling part of this, to say other things matter as part of that formula. And so I can go into a lot more detail on that. I can wonk out if you want me to. But having to have designed one of these systems, these are important trade-offs to have a conversation about.
Again, personally, I couldn't agree more. If you have 15, it's too much.
Yeah.
You can't communicate it. So 3 or 4 very, very clear ones. One, just to ask, should success, whether it's preparedness for college or success in college completion, should those kinds of metrics be part of a K-12 accountability system or not?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think you're going to get some pushback from schools on that, but I think we got to have I actually think one of the best parts about ESSA is it gives us an opportunity to iterate. So if I was sitting in a state, I'd begin reporting those, but probably not put them in my system until I could figure out how good the data is. Because right now, not every state is following high school kids into college or career or long-term success. But I think a high school or a middle school should be accountable for whether or not those kids are successful 3 years down the road. Now the question is, how do you do that, and how do you do it in a way that doesn't sort of replicate the challenges we have now about kids going to college, and then the set of kids that don't go on to college are much harder to track, actually, and whether or not, and success is much harder to define for them, actually. So I think in concept, that's absolutely right. So I would try to figure out a way to report that data without making it part of the formula early on. So
DC, and again, has been a leader, I think, in being more sophisticated on the accountability side than many places over the years. Do you see the passage of the new law? Is this a chance to start over? Is this a chance to tweak? How are you thinking very concretely about the opportunity this law presents, and what do you want to do differently? What do you want to maintain? What do you want to do better?
Absolutely. So in DC, really over the last several years, we've had multiple accountability systems running in parallel with each other. So DC had an ESSA flexibility waiver that was operated by my agency, the State Education Agency, that categorized schools in one of 5 different levels. And then the Public Charter School Board here, the charter authorizer, has had its own system called the Performance Management Framework that it uses to manage the performance of its schools. So making decisions around closures, for example, or which LEAs are able to expand. And the Public Charter School Board, I should say, has been one of the most aggressive authorizers in the country, I think, in really focusing on performance and making tough choices based on that data. And then DCPS, as our largest traditional district, has had its own way of looking at its struggling schools that it calls its 40-40 plan. And I think what we've really seen is that having these multiple systems running in parallel has had some benefits in that we can see how different metrics are playing out, but also has led to a lot of challenges and confusion, both for schools and trying to figure out sort of what are the best schools across the city that we should be emulating and learning from, and what are the most struggling schools where we need to provide additional resources and supports, and also confusion for families as they're making choices. Many of our families look at the performance management framework when weighing different charter schools, but they don't have that same information when it comes to the traditional schools and the choices they might be making there. And so we think this is a real opportunity, given where we are in the city, again, with nearly half of our students enrolled in one sector and the other half in the other, to step back and say, what is a system we could build that could be consistent across all schools, and that gives us a chance to have that consistent information both for parents and families and for our schools and educators. So we're excited about that opportunity and partnering with our stakeholders in developing this system. I should note in particular that our State Board of Education has been incredibly involved and engaged in this process. We actually have a couple of members from the State Board in the audience here, so I thank Laura Wilson-Thalen and Ruth Wattenberg for being here, as well as some of the staff members. We've also been working really closely with the authorizer, the Public Charter School Board, and I think one thing that we're particularly excited about is not just having a consistent system across all schools, but the opportunity for both the state and the authorizer to potentially be using the same system and thinking differently about sort of what are our roles in that system, but the chance to really have common information and for both organizations to be using it. And I credit a lot the leadership of our Public Charter School Board for being as excited about this opportunity as we are.
And take a minute, again, the theory of choice is fantastic in creating options that didn't exist before, and having, one system accountability helps in terms of the communication. Both you and Chris have talked about that these can't be academic exercises, these have to penetrate the parents. But how do you guys think about, how do you make sure that when you have a system of choice, it's just not the engaged parents, the affluent parents who are exercising choice, and the child whose, dad is incarcerated and the mom is on crack? How are you making sure that those kids somehow have access to this information and choice, so there's actual real choice for them and not just in theory?
We've made strides each year in sort of getting better at sharing this information with parents. So one step that DC took in the last few years that's been really important is a common lottery system that applies for all schools of choice across the city, both schools of choice within DCPS and among our public charter schools. So it's called My School DC, and there's now a common enrollment process, deadline, format, and the team that works on this is fielding calls from parents every day, both in multiple languages and also finding opportunities to engage in the community to make sure that parents really do have access to these choices.
Chris, concretely, if there are 2 or 3 states that you think are ahead of the curve on this, that are sort of models for the nation, if you could sort of specifically say who those are and what you like about them. And then to your point, there's a chance for states to do some great things, and there's a chance for states to backslide. And frankly, we will probably see both. And so talk to me about the highlights, but talk to me about how we collectively should be thinking about states where there's less creativity, less courage, less innovation, and what happens for kids in those states.
Well, so a bunch of the states, and I always hesitate to name states, I'm going to, but there are more states out there doing good things.
I'll keep asking if you don't, so you spit it out.
So many of these states took the opportunity of the waiver from No Child Left Behind to start down the path of these systems. So you see a state like Minnesota, who has already begun giving gap closure reports to their districts and writing them very.
Explain that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big thing is that they've actually set out goals for their districts in terms of improvement in each of these groups the racial groups in their state, and they're starting to see progress on that. They're starting to see their districts begin closing those gaps. They've focused on them to the point where they're sending very specific letters with goals to their districts, to the school boards of those districts, to the superintendents. I don't think everybody in the state loved getting those, right? Like it didn't start as a good thing. But what it did bring is a focus to those numbers, and now we're seeing more kids actually achieving on proficiency levels in the state of Minnesota because of how they incentivized those pieces. DC has an equity report, so and I'll have you talk about that because you know it better than I do. But the focus on actually improving these things and not just talking about improving them, but actually putting words behind it has been huge in those 2 places specifically. I'd also add Tennessee, New York, Kentucky, not surprisingly. They're all having in-state conversation about their values right now. And what do they think is the most important thing to put in these accountability systems? I think what they've done well is, I talked earlier about not having too many metrics. I think Tennessee and New York are putting guardrails around that conversation so that we don't end up with everything people value in the state, but that they actually talk about the things they value the most. They're doing some things like first choice, right? Like if we had to put one of these 2 things in our system, what's more important to the success of our kids? And I will touch on, I think California, despite the fact that some of the early returns on that may be that they have maybe 1 too many metrics, I think they're headed in the right direction. I really do believe that California is out front in terms of thinking about what does a holistic system look like to improve their schools. And boy, wouldn't it be great if California had a system like that, given how many kids are affected by that. So I'm hopeful that California will take their early drafts of their accountability system, continue to improve them, and hit the mark that will actually drive change in the state. I mean, again, I can't emphasize enough, the states that are being the most successful are talking less about the formula to get to accountability and more about what are they going to do to improve schools, how are they going to help kids, what are the systems that we need to put in place to break down some of these racial gaps. Like those are the conversations that are real in states. And the formulas are exciting, and I really like formulas, and so I like talking about them. But the bigger question is, what are we going to do on the backside of identifying these schools? So.
And take a minute, again, not to name them, but where states are, you're more concerned, or you're seeing, again, less curves. What, can we do anything? Should we do anything? Do we just let that play? What should be the collective response, if any?
Sure. I mean, all our states are great, but the challenge space, I think, comes in when you don't have an engaged community in the state. So many of you work for either civil rights organizations or advocacy organizations in this room. Even if we have an adversarial relationship in a certain state, I really value what you do, because I think you're calling the right questions for us as a country. Are we going to just go forward, build a new system, not really have much change, and in 10 years from now, we're gonna have the same schools serving the same kids? Like, that's the question. And if that's where we are, that's not the business I'm in. I know that's not the business you guys are in. And so if we look back in 10 years and we have the same schools in a state underperforming for kids, we haven't been successful. And so where I worry is where there's lots of words, but there's no sense of urgency. And so I think that, and again, I don't see that in many places, but when I do see it, I really try to push us to think about, okay, what's going to be different this time? Like, we had a big difference between pre-NCLB and post-NCLB. There was a big difference. You know, argue about whatever happened in terms of testing and all that. Things changed for kids in most states. I want that to happen again. I think we had sort of outlived the usefulness of No Child Left Behind. Now we're in a new era where states are going to have more control, so any excuse they had to not step up, it's sort of been pulled away. So that's how we're working with states. And so, I mean, I think the thing that I'm looking for the most is, can we actively really disrupt these systems that haven't been working for kids? So.
If I could just add on to that, I think Chris is absolutely right that the power in this comes not just in the design of a system, because there are really important conversations to be had in that stage, but in how we use this information and the power of shaping the conversation. So I spent almost 4 years in Tennessee as the chief of staff at the Tennessee Department of Education, and I came into that role just as we were getting our waiver, or developing our waiver application for the first time. And then several years later, we reflected on the accountability system we'd built through that process as we were going for our waiver renewal. And so it was a really unique opportunity to be part of 2 design phases of an accountability system. And I think what we saw is that there's so much power in shaping the conversation alone. There were other impacts as well. But when we built our waiver system, we really focused on this notion of growth for all students, but also ensuring faster progress for the students who are furthest behind. And it led to a more focused conversation on closing gaps than had existed under No Child Left Behind. Longtime superintendents were coming to us and saying, we're having a different conversation about what's happening in our schools because of the way you've designed this system. And that's incredibly important. And it also called out in a different way the districts and the schools that we were holding up as exemplary, as the places to learn from. And I think sometimes we focus so much on the struggling schools, and that is obviously incredibly important, but also how we're defining what we're aiming for is incredibly important in systems as well. So under the system we designed, our exemplary districts were the ones who were making the most progress, and that was sometimes already high-performing districts who are also making great gains. Sometimes it was our most struggling districts who were making tremendous strides. And similarly, when we looked at our schools, we defined as reward schools the schools that were both at the highest levels of achievement and the schools that were making the most growth. And the most exciting were we had a big group of schools that were actually at the intersection of both of those. So to be high-achieving and making high progress, the schools that were making tremendous growth, those were really exciting things to celebrate and to learn from.
One more concrete question for both of you on metrics, and we'll talk about some other stuff, is I think there's a legitimate conversation, debate, and again, if we're going with a small basket and not 15 or 30 indicators, how many of those should be input-based metrics and how many of those should be outcome-based metrics, or what percent, what's the mix of that portfolio? So as you guys think, maybe start with you locally and then sort of nationally, what's your sense of, should they be all outcome, all input, some mix? If so, how do you balance those things?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I think the hardest thing, I don't know that there's a magic balance, but I think that one of the great benefits of ESSA is obviously the chance for every state to sort of step back and say, in our context, given where we are, what is most important to focus on, and then how do we design our measures around that context. I think with all of these choices, inputs versus outputs, the number of measures, whether they should be leading or lagging indicators, I mean, with any of these choices, I think the key thing to look at is just how you strike the right balance given the context that you're operating in, and also just what kinds of signals are you then sending? I think the heart of education is the interaction that's happening between a teacher and a child in a classroom, and everything else we do is just shaping the environment that operates around that interaction to try and focus that conversation or that those expectations in a different way. And so I think it's not only, I think the answers come down to sort of what signals are those measures going to send by including them in the system.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The only thing I would add is I would stay more focused on outputs, because I think in a system where you're trying to show what you value, I still value in our schools that kids are being able to read. They're engaged. I think an engagement metric is an output metric, because kids then have hope for their future. So I think that those are more outcome measures. I would say on the input side, I would really lean in on the school improvement side with all the input metrics. So I don't know that I would put them in my formula for accountability. I think I'd say we're going to identify some schools, and then I would collect a whole lot of input metrics on the schools that are lower performing and use them as part of the school improvement process. Because I don't think output metrics don't tell you how to improve. They just tell you where you are. The input metrics are much better at telling you how to improve. So I think I would divide those two up if I was building a system.
All right, and let's stay right there, because I want to shift a bit, because I think we're all strong proponents of accountability, but I think it's a very fair statement that no accountability system ever taught a kid to read or helped them go to college. And so you need a system, but to what you guys both said, is what you do with that system. What are the tangible, practical interventions or changes that happen for that child or for that school or for that district that helps them get a better education this year compared to last year? So, Chris, if you could talk concretely, and then Hansel, on how accountability information can and should translate to something different happening for a fifth grader or for a ninth grader.
Well, I mean, I think there's two things that a state, I think, needs to do. First, I think they have to work with their districts closer than they have. I think generally we've been giving districts and schools information and haven't been sort of leaning in on how do we improve this school. So first off is the district has a huge role in helping here. And given that states don't hire teachers, don't hire principals, a lot of this is about leadership and in these buildings. And so we have to have the conversation. You know, one of the things that was really controversial under SIG was replacing half the staff, right?
Sorry,
And so,
explain SIG.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. School improvement grants that were under, when Secretary Duncan was in office, there was a program where states could apply to have their lowest performing schools part of the school improvement grant program. And then there were 4 models in that grant program. One of them was to replace the principal, replace the staff. It was an aggressive intervention. And I think some of that, we got to be honest about whether or not it will work in certain places. Rural communities, it's much harder because the staffing isn't available. There were some challenges with that. But I think we have to be honest about leadership matters deeply in many of these schools. And so states, I think, should be leaning in to help their districts understand that, you know, after 3 or 4 years, if we can't see some growth. Now, I'm not talking about proficiency. I'm really not. I am talking about on a pathway. Why is DC getting so much attention? It's because they're the fastest growing district on NAEP, right? They are headed in the right direction. So I'm much more willing to be patient with when we're headed in the right direction than if I just see stagnant growth as a state. So I think the state has to define their role clearly for their districts, and then help them think about what does it really mean to improve these schools. In many places, we just lack the courage to go in and do these hard things, and I think we have to do some of those things. I also think we have to engage the community in what the change looks like, because that's one of the things that has been missing, is especially with state takeovers or things like that. When it's worked, it's been that the community has risen up and said, our schools are going to be better than this. And they've led on it with the help of the state. When the state has come in and said, well, this is our job, we're going to run these schools, it's been harder. It's been much harder. So I think we've got to have a conversation about how that takes place. In terms of really concrete things, though, I just think early interventions around reading, I think early childhood is an important intervention, especially in low-performing elementary schools. They're getting kids that aren't ready for kindergarten, so I think we do need to invest in the early years. I think we need to invest in reading interventions, especially up to grade 3 and beyond. We're finding the gaps just get bigger in elementary schools. So many of the middle schools and high schools that are failing in the country are a result of what happens beforehand. So getting kids on a good start, and I know this administration was active on trying to get early childhood at the federal level, but as state chiefs, we see many states stepping up and passing early childhood, trying to figure out what we're doing with 4-year-olds. I have a 4 and a 1-year-old, so I'm pretty interested in that. It's something that I think is really important to the long-term success of the country. So,
Walk through again here in DC, the best accountability system is simply information. What do you guys do with information to make changes for the kids in schools who need the most help?
Absolutely. I think first, just to grab onto something Chris was saying at the end there, we in DC believe deeply in the importance of early childhood education, and we're blessed that we have a universal pre-K system in the district, and we also, at my agency, we govern all of birth to 5 early childhood, actually, so the licensed child care centers and family homes across the city are an important part of our portfolio of work, and we're very focused on how do we improve quality and access to all of early care and education, birth to 5 in the city. And we agree that that's an incredibly important strand of how we'll set up our students for success later in their educations as well. I think when it comes to sort of how you support struggling schools, I draw a lot of lessons from my experience in Tennessee. And one of the places in Tennessee that we really looked at was Memphis. When we first ran our list of priority schools, the bottom 5% of schools across the state, 69 of the 83 schools were in the city of Memphis. And so really needed to focus there in particular in that community. And there's been a lot of attention paid, I think, to the work of the Achievement School District, which was a state-led turnaround district. But at the same time, a huge part of our work from the state level and thinking about supporting our struggling schools was also helping our local education agencies develop innovation zones to lead their own efforts to turn around schools. And in Memphis, one of the things that was most exciting was this was a real chance for both the Achievement School District to operate, but also Shelby County Schools, the traditional district, to establish and lead an innovation zone. And I think having both those entities operating there, those schools have really pushed each other about what's possible and how much progress can be made. And I think that both strands of that state approach, both supporting our local education agencies with resources and strategies, and as well as the state turnaround district, have been critical to the success there. And I think, I draw again lessons from that in thinking about where we'll be in DC as we think about partnering with our local education agencies and our public charter school board, thinking about sort of how we make information common, but also remain flexible and strategic about the different roles that each entity plays in supporting our struggling schools.
I just think struggling schools, we've got to find a way to give kids hope. Like that seems to be when I go into community. I traveled to the Blackfoot Indian Reservation in northern Montana, and the places where they were, where the kids were doing the best, were where they felt like they had a pathway, either to be in the community and serve in that community, or a pathway to higher ed, or a pathway out into a conversation, and then to come back into the community, because there was just such cultural importance for their kids to come back. It was all they had, was the capital that those kids could produce. I just don't think we can talk about a single solution in all of these places, because culturally it matters deeply what we need to do in each of these places. And so the commonality is trying to figure out how we give kids hope. And one of the ways to do that is make sure they can read, write, do math, do science, have a holistic education. But the other way is to talk to them about their futures. And when the teachers in that community don't see a future for those kids, then those kids don't see their future. So I think it's a huge piece of this too. So.
I couldn't agree more, Chris. And I started my career as a high school social studies teacher, teaching on a reservation in New Mexico, actually, in the Navajo Nation. And I think, again, that's seeing the difference between sort of what was needed in that community versus where I work now in DC, I think is a critical part of why I think the importance of ESSA is being able to fit the context that you are operating in. And I appreciate both of your leadership in bringing more attention to the needs of Native American students, because I think that's just critical in our country.
So you talk about gaps, that's the most devastating gap by far.
Yeah.
By far. Yeah. We've talked a lot about accountability. Chris, you talked about the importance of high standards, and while there's some controversy there, it's hard for someone to make a case we need lower standards. Someone can try and make that case. That's not very compelling to me. What we haven't talked at all about is assessments, and you're an assessment guy. Just to take 1 second, as a nation, should we have 50 state assessments? Should we have one assessment? Should we have somewhere in between that?
Yeah.
And if we're trying to really accelerate the pace of change, have transparency, know who's moving the needle, again, whether it's on a reservation or in a rural community or an inner city community, if you could sort of fix this, wave a magic wand, what would assessment look like for the nation?
Yeah. Well, I know how you feel about this, but I think that we entered that conversation with the assessment groups thinking that we didn't know quite yet what the strongest assessment would look like, and it's why we wanted more than one group. We produced 2 really good assessments in those groups. Smarter Balance and Park have produced really high-quality assessments, better than any state has been able to do, in my opinion. And so, ideally, we would have the same metrics across the country. Is it going to take us some time to get there? Absolutely. So I think as we iterate, we will begin to start seeing more commonality. States desire the ability to compare outside their state lines. They desire that. That is not, all politics aside about whether or not you can give Park or Smarter Balance. I hear from state chiefs very consistently, I want to be able to tell my kids how they're doing against kids across the country, and let alone across the country, across the world. And so I don't think that desire is going to go away. So I think we're going to move more towards commonality. I don't think Park and Smarter Balance necessarily will be the end solution to all of this. Right now we have very strong assessments in those states. But I could see a Park 2.0 that included more metrics, included more states, or another way to engage with Smarter Balance, where maybe you didn't have to give the whole test, but you could give some of those items. There's a lot of conversation about how states engage with those types of tests. I could also see a group of states starting up, a group to give a test together. You already start seeing, states like Utah and Florida are sharing the same item pool, right? And they're not connected in any sort of way. So we are beginning to see that, there's only a certain number of ways to write these high quality items. And I think you're going to see them more and more across the country. So, do we get there? We don't get there via the assessment consortium, but I think we get there eventually. And I think this is something that I don't know why we have to have more than one assessment other than local politics play out. And so that doesn't seem like a good reason to me to not continue to fight for some comparable data. I also think that the reason behind the data is really important because as a country, we haven't had the same expectations for our kids depending on what state you're living. I'm going to say that again because I think it's really important. As a country, we haven't had the same expectations depending on what state you're living in. There have been lower expectations in many of our states for their kids. And I don't think any state wants to be in that position. And the fastest way to solve that is to begin giving similar or the same assessments. Now, there's ways to do this so states can hold on and have their teachers be part of this process. So there are creative ways we could write items in a state and make sure those items are on their state test. There's a lot of ways to do this that don't involve everybody giving the exact same test. But we're going to move towards that. I don't think we're giving up on that. And by no means do I think either of those consortia are going to fail. I think they've already been wildly successful. So,
I would just add, DC is a member of the Park Consortium, and it's been a huge part of the efforts in DC, in our city. I talked about the raised level of expectations, but Park is where those expectations become concrete for educators to latch onto and to see the difference. When we released results last fall for the first time, we shared what a writing item used to look like on our old DC CAS assessment versus what it looked like on Park. In 7th grade, the writing item used to be, in your own words, describe what you would view as your perfect vacation, right? And that was the writing question for 7th graders. Narrative, just out of your imagination, write about this. On Park, instead, a sample item was you read these two texts, The Count of Monte Cristo and Beloved, compare and contrast how the author develops theme in these two texts, citing examples. And you think about the writing expectations for our students when they get to college, and which of those questions is going to better set them up for what they need to do when they get to that first year of college, and there's just no comparison. And so I think it's the work that we do through Park is critical to our work here in DC. I would just add to what Chris said, that I think comparability is not just important to states, it's important to districts and to schools, which is why we need it. Right now we have NAEP, which gives us information across all states, but I've heard districts and schools say, I wish I had NAEP data too, right? Like beyond just the trial urban district assessment. I wish I knew how I was doing compared to these other places, and that's the promise that Park holds out. Not just that we can see which states are leading the way, but which districts, which schools can we learn from? Who is doing their best in serving the special education students within their community? It's something we are critically interested to see. Who is making growth among those students, and how can we learn from and emulate those practices? So this is not just for states, it is for educators, for schools, for district leaders to be able to learn from.
Two final questions we want to open up to you guys, and these are tough questions. We'll try and keep your answers a little bit short because I want to get to the audience. So, for better or worse, I'd say largely, usually for worse, unfortunately, the intersection of education and politics, or policy and politics, we all play at that nexus. And it's interesting whether you're talking about accountability systems or whether you're talking about trying to get more money for poor kids and poor schools, Chris, that you talked about. The politics of this shapes that you interestingly have often the unions and the right pushing against more accountability or pushing against more money for poor kids, and the civil rights groups pushing for stronger accountability and for more resources for poor kids. So I'd like to hear both you guys just sort of personally in that debate around stronger accountability or not, more resources for poor communities or not. Where do you guys think we should land?
Yeah, I think this is a really tough question because I'm drawn towards more strong, to use the word stronger accountability. That would be where I would be drawn towards. I think the harder part is sometimes we've been so, what we thought was strong accountability was actually just reporting out data and telling schools how they were doing and not giving them any support and sort of saying good luck.
No strategy.
Yeah, right, no strategy behind it. And so I think that in many ways breaks down trust even more than like a weaker accountability system with a lot of support. So I think that's why these conversations, I actually, I understand how you pose the question, but I'm trying to break down those lines. Like, I don't think you have to be against accountability to be for supporting schools and trying to do something different around only using a test score and things like that. So I just think there's a new way that's going to emerge here where states can be for kids, and I'll have a clear accountability system that gives us good information, but that we actually take action on it, because that's what we're all interested in. Honestly, all factions of that group that you described are interested in kids having a better experience, honestly. I mean, there's a handful that I would maybe say aren't, but almost everybody is in this because they believe that kids can do better. And they just have different pathways to get there. So I think we've got to have a different conversation in the country about sort of holding the bar on giving good information, making sure that we're being ferocious about we got to change something in places where we need to change something, and that we don't come back in 5 years and say, yeah, we talked about it, but we didn't get it done. So like, be really hard on the side of action, but don't be hard on sort of which metrics we're using or are we sending the right signals. Like, we can do that, and that's something that's very important. But action is the thing that's going to change things for kids. Yeah.
That's right, that you have to think about that balance between accountability and support. So I think about DCPS, for example, which had one of the first teacher evaluation systems in the country, but has also done more work than almost any district I can think of in terms of planning around curriculum and providing instructional resources and tools for their teachers. And I think that makes a lot of sense to think about both supports and accountability. I think about charter networks in DC, where I see incredibly high expectations for their educators and what they'll do for students, but at the same time really investing in instructional coaching models and the kinds of mentoring and professional development that are available in classrooms and schools. And so I think that when you look sort of when you look closer to the ground, you see people finding ways to balance those really high expectations for what will happen with the supports needed to get people there.
Last question. This is a serious question. What are you each most looking forward to in a Clinton presidency and most worried about? And what are you most looking forward to in a Trump presidency? And what are you most worried about? Who's first?
Do you want to go first, Arne? I can go first. I'm actually just confused about where both of them will be. So that is the thing that I think I had the hardest time commenting on. Education hasn't been a serious topic in either campaign, in my opinion. Trying to make sure that as whoever wins, as we transition, I'm actually looking forward to them setting an agenda, and that we can be a part of setting that agenda for them. And so thinking about the transition time as being really important for whoever wins. So that's one of the probably what I'm looking forward to the most. I think, a concerning thing is whether or not, on the Republican side, whether or not we would prioritize education as a country. We can argue about whether states should be in charge of the federal government, and there is a federal role in education, so, states are okay with that, and trying to figure out what that role is and making sure that we just don't get into a conversation about kicking everything back to the states, I think would be the concern. I think under a Clinton presidency, I would want to make sure, and I think our states would be really interested in making sure that we're able to continue in the momentum that we have with the current planning we're doing on ESSA, that we weren't asked to sort of relitigate some of the things that we've litigated in the past, especially around making sure all kids are served through our accountability system. So, all those concerns, I think, are quite easy to deal with, actually. And I think one of the, everybody's been asking for a conversation on education in this campaign. I'm not sure we want that, guys. I'm just being honest. I think being able to set that going forward is a better place to be than trying to live it in the campaign. So,
thank you.
I guess the only thing I would add is just that, states are working now closely on these ESSA accountability plans, and we know that they'll be due to the U.S. Department of Education in 2017, and I think uncertainty around direction is tough, but I think everyone is sort of buckling down and saying we're going to focus on sort of what we need at the state level within our own context, and hope that the federal support will be there for continuing the work that we're already planning on.
Yeah. All right, let's open it up, and we have about 20 minutes, and to state the obvious, please ask a question, don't make a statement, don't relitigate something. What's your question? Very directly, so we can get to as many as we can, and we'll try and answer them very directly. You're the boss. Yeah.
That's delegation. Good morning. In this room, I've heard panelists talk about education and saying former educators in the advocacy realm say that you couldn't pay them enough to work for a bad principal. On the other hand, I've also heard people say that there's a disproportionate expectation on principals with high achievement gaps versus ones with low achievement gaps. And principals are valued more for managing up than managing down. So in terms of those things said in this room in different panels, how do you see that playing out in different standards for schools?
You want to talk about the district?
Yeah. Why don't you just take concretely DC and try some.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually going to just give an example from my past experience in Tennessee, where I agree that the role of the school leader is critical. One of the things we did as part of the Common Core transition was provide optional trainings for school districts to participate in, both at the teacher level, but also at the school leader level. And one of the things we heard was while the initial frame was around this transition on standards, that many school leaders said this is actually one of the most helpful leadership experiences I've ever had in getting ready for this role. And I think it was really around the crux of that was finding really highly effective current principals and assistant principals who were leading that training for their peers, and that ability to be able to speak at a really concrete level around, here's how we're managing this change in my building, and here are the steps we're taking. So I think that power of peer-to-peer learning and the importance of providing support to our school leaders is something that we can all draw lessons from.
I think we should overinvest in places where things haven't been going as well. So I don't think you have to set up this situation where a principal has to be the hero. So what that means is, for me, maybe we need 3 or 4 leadership people in a building that needs turnaround. We've got to think differently about what it means to be a principal, especially in buildings that you're asking a principal to take on so many different things, be the instructional leader, be the vision setter for the school, deal with discipline. So I just think there's a lot of things we could do as districts to think differently about not investing identically in every school in your district. And I think this comes from a lot of the charter model too, what do we need to be successful with those kids is what we should be doing, not necessarily just putting the same staffing structure into every school. So,
Take one in the back.
Morning. A question, I think, mainly for Dr. Hansen about the selection of school measures. And I'm a public school teacher across the river in Virginia. And a couple years ago, we got told the state of Virginia just decided they're not going to collect certain data really at the intersection of income and race. They just told us they're not going to. I'm a former professor of education research, too, and so I know this data would be really helpful. So my question is, this is a couple years ago, so before ESSA, is there a transparency mechanism in ESSA so that the selection of this stuff really gets, is one of the things that's communicated to the communities?
got it. Dr. Hansen is down here. So I'm Chris Minnick. I'm the executive director of CCSSO. So I'll answer on behalf of the states. If you have some thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them, actually. But I think in terms of transparency in ESSA, there are many new data requirements that are not being talked about yet. And I think one of them is school finance. And we didn't touch on this yet, but I think schools are now going to be required to report out how much money they're spending in a way that we haven't had to be transparent about in the past. So that's one place where I think we're going to get more transparent. I also think every state is required to engage stakeholders in the law. So there are meetings going on about ESSA in your state. Whether or not you know about them yet, we've got to do a better job as states communicating that out, because I just think that a different conversation is going to go on in the country about metrics, and you're going to want to be in those discussions because you care deeply about those previously reported data that you could use. The only other thing I'd touch on is there is a real conversation in the country about privacy and how much data we're collecting, and I think states are trying to balance those two things. They're trying to balance the idea that we need good information, especially in the aggregate. Nobody should be arguing about aggregate information, but we also need to protect the privacy of our kids from things that either data we collect that we don't use or data that's inappropriate to collect. So I think we have to have all those conversations, and I would lean in your state, especially. I know for a fact, I've been to one of them, so Virginia is having conversations, and I can talk to you afterwards if you want to know more about that, but it's important to engage in these discussions now because states are making those decisions in the next 6 to 9 months.
Take one up front.
Hi, good morning. So earlier, when you all were talking about states' ability to influence teachers actually teaching kids how to read, and how limited that role is in hiring teachers, as someone who just took my certification exams, I couldn't help but think about the state's role in teacher certification, and if you would consider that as a potential pathway to increase quality of instruction.
That's a whole nother panel we need to do on that
Yeah,
one.
we could do another hour on that. I'll do a little bit, and then
one-
you want to do
Take
what's
1
going on in
minute, but
DC.
that's
Yeah,
a
so
huge,
quick.
huge, great question. It's a great question.
Did you pass? Congratulations. Good. Glad you're going to be a teacher. So I think certification is an underused lever in most states. And what happens in most places, we're checking boxes, we're trying to make sure we're doing background checks, we're doing things like that. And in reality, I think we should be talking about, I think certification should be an ongoing process where, you may get an initial certification, but you got to come back and show that your skills have improved over the first 2 years or something like that, and not necessarily be a test that you take, but a process that you go through to continue to improve, and then show at some point that you are certified to help kids learn to read and do math and all that. So I just think it's not a one-time thing, and I think that's where states get caught up. You have a test that you pass, and then you're certified. So that's how I'm trying to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's the right distinction to draw, both between initial certification or licensure and renewals, which usually in states it's a multi-step process. In DC, one of the things we've looked at is for renewals, adding a pathway. So keeping our traditional pathways to renewal that were more based on exams or professional development credits, but also adding a pathway that's based on demonstrated effectiveness, so that can also be a route towards showing that you should be able to renew your license.
One in the back.
Hi. One comment and one question. First, my comment. There have been a lot of comments about the extraordinary progress that DC schools have made on NAEP, and I just want to make the point, as I think Hansel Kung did, that great progress is mainly about our average progress, and it's not about the progress of the lowest performing and the lowest income kids in the city, who by and large have been doing somewhere between low and stagnant. Now, it depends on your baseline year, and it depends on your grade, and it depends on your subject. But I think it's really important that as we go forward, we learn the right lessons from DC. And I'm a DC parent, was for a long time, and there's great things going on here, but we shouldn't overlook that fact. But now, my question. Secretary King has talked a lot about the importance of a rich curriculum and how ESSA is an opportunity to move beyond just reading and math, and there have been a number of articles and people have talked about the different titles in ESSA that create funds and grants to focus on rich curriculum. My question is, as long as the testing accountability is just on reading and math, how much can we really expect schools to take that seriously and move on it? And what, if any, recommendations do you have on that? Thanks.
I'll talk about the second part and let you talk about DC. I think states should be using other metrics that aren't just reading and math. So that's what we should be doing, and we should be. Again, I think it ties to the values conversation. What do you value that your student would be able to do when they leave high school or they leave the school that they're in? And for me, I would value them being able to do other things other than reading and math. Now, it's pretty essential that they can do reading and math. So I don't think we need to back away from that. But I think we also need to make sure that we're adding other things to these conversations. If I was in a state and I was designing a system, my academic performance indicators would include as much information as I could get on other subjects. The problem we have is I don't think the solution is to give a test in every subject. I think that, A, that's not politically viable, and B, we're just sending the wrong signals, and then everybody would be chasing different things. And so I think using academic performance out of reading and math, seeing if we can get a science metric in there, seeing if there's a good way to incorporate social studies and world history into some of those systems. Career readiness and those types of things are really important as well. So how do we make sure that we're signaling the right things, but we're not adding so many things to the metric that you can't even determine what I should be going for as a school. So that's how I'm talking about it. I completely agree with you that the reading and math only conversation has to end. And I think it is ending, actually, so.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that I think one of the shifts with Common Core and with Common Core aligned assessments is that literacy is not just fiction, right? It's also informational text, and it's literacy in science, in the humanities, and in technical subjects. And I think that's a really exciting step. So in Tennessee, our career and technical education team was doing a lot of work around building model units for CTE teachers to use, looking at literacy in those technical subjects and how they could advance that. And I think because of the importance of literacy, because of the challenge of it, having more and more people within the building who are focused on it, having it not just live in English class is a really exciting step. And it's about building, I think, students' context and fluency in those subject matters as well as in literacy. That's really key. Just one other point that I think, Ruth, we can certainly continue the conversation, but I think when you look at NAEP data broken out by quartile, you see that the lowest quartile and the highest quartile, all quartiles have actually increased over time, and that progress really, while it's not enough and while it's not reaching enough of our students yet, that the progress is pretty widespread across different groups of our students.
Up front.
So in thinking about racial achievement gaps and the barriers to success that exist beyond the classroom, what opportunities or what do you think schools could be doing better to respond to the mental health needs of at-risk students, and how are there any opportunities under ESSA to start aligning systems?
Yeah. Well, Title IV, which has been called a block grant, I don't think really is a block grant. So I think there are some very specific things we should be doing with that money. States have the opportunity. Title IV in ESSA is the consolidation of a bunch of programs. So safe and drug-free schools, some of the bullying stuff's in there. So Title IV now has the opportunity to be used in really creative ways in the ways you're talking about. So if I was sitting in a state or a district that gets Title IV money, I would be thinking about, what do I need to do to serve these kids? Is it doctor's appointments? Is it being able to see the board? Is it mental health? There are a lot of things that you can do with that money now. So that's the biggest opportunity I see is under the Title IV funds, which are now much more flexible than they were in the past. So.
I just add in DC, I think this is something we're really looking at. We, over the past year, in partnership with the State Board of Education, have revised our health standards, and one of the big shifts was putting more of an emphasis on mental health in our health standards across grades. And we're also thinking about how we use information from our health assessment, the youth risk behavior survey that's given, and school health profiles to sort of triangulate information and give more information back to schools about how they can better meet the comprehensive health needs of their students.
One in the back, please.
Returning quickly to the question of measures, I wanted to talk about measuring achievement in high school. A lot of states are moving back toward using SAT and ACT as their proficiency measure. And I know there are a lot of concerns about the fact that those tests were not necessarily designed with state standards in mind. And even states that are using smarter balanced, like Delaware, are then switching and using SAT, and that will be really the key point of data for accountability systems. I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit to that and how states should be thinking about using college entrance exams more broadly in their accountability systems. It seems better suited to a student success measure than necessarily an academic achievement measure.
You want me to talk about that? Or you want to?
I can.
Okay.
So I think it's a great question. I think the challenge in our high schools is that students are taking a lot of different types of assessments for different purposes, right? Students are taking standards-based high school assessments. They're taking college entrance exams. They're taking AP courses and exams or IB exams. And I think everyone's trying to figure out sort of what's the right balance between and how we use these assessments. In DC, we've been providing free access to SAT for all of our students in our schools, but we still have a standards-based high school assessment through Park, and I think other states are just trying to figure out sort of what's the right balance there right now.
Yeah, and I think we're encouraging our states to think about balance here. High school is the place where this over-testing thing plays out the most directly. It's hard to justify for a college-going kid that they got to stop and then take a state test after they've taken the SAT or the ACT 3 or 4 times. Now, I would argue that we possibly are encouraging our kids to take those tests too many times. So the retake effect and all that is an interesting concept. The thing that we should acknowledge, though, that both those brands mean something to parents. And I think we have to lean in on the SAT and the ACT side and say to them, look, your college entrance is really important for you guys, and that's something that that you guys were designed for. You're predictive of college success in in some ways, and so so thinking about how do we use those tests in a high school setting, I think is really important. More importantly, though, is the signaling to kids. I think states are going towards these tests not so much because they love what they do for their accountability system, but that you're signaling to every kid in the state that you have a future, whether it's in college or a job training program, that you're already setting that expectation for the kids. So I kind of like the transition because I think it's setting a good tone for what the kids are doing. I do think we have to work on the assessments to make sure that we're getting the information that we need. So.
And if I could just add to that, I think one other thing is, the whole reason behind the PARCC and Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, and even the moves that states are making outside of that, is too many kids were doing well on high school assessments and then struggling when they got to college. And having that information sooner when you can do something about it in high school is really important. And I think, I mentioned before a writing question. One of the key skills we see students struggling with is writing when they get to college, and writing based on text. And so how we think about getting that real information to our students and our families while they're still in high school when they can address those needs, I think is critically important.
Agreed.
Do one more up front, one in the back, and then sorry, we have to close at that point. So last one up front, and then one more in the back.
A somewhat political question. Race to the top was a federal policy under the current administration. Is that still out there, race to the top? Or under ESSA, or am I mixing apples and oranges? The reason I bring up this topic, race to the top, having been in education for many years myself, I know that it created a lot of upset among teachers and among administrators that we're competing among ourselves, among the states, when the problem is really deeper and on a more cooperative level. So I was wondering, again, to clarify, is race to the top still out there? And whether or not it is, would there be comment about the helpfulness of that policy in terms of where we are now?
Do you want to comment on this? Okay.
I'm
I'm happy to comment if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
But, okay, so I think to sort of take you off the hook on this, because I don't think, so that's the guy that was in charge of it. So there you go. So I think Race to the Top was, in my opinion, some of the most innovative policy making that we've seen, because it gave states choices. There was a real choice between doing this or not doing this. They set out some clear expectations. They said, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to. But these are the things that we're interested in funding as a federal government. Did it create some challenges in states? Absolutely. But I will tell you, those decisions were made mostly by state policymakers, not by the federal government. Now that I said something nice, I'm going to say something not nice. I think the waiver policy, which followed Race to the Top, didn't create real choices for states. So the choice was between keeping your NCLB system or doing the things that the administration wanted you to do. And I think that was not a real choice. So what I think was really innovative about the Race to the Top system is that states did have real choices. Like, they could either do it or not do it. I think under waivers, that wasn't the same thing. I think states were either stay with your old system that's not working, or do all these things that we want you to do. All these things. There were 4 things. But and so I don't think. I would say Race to the Top, I think, was excellent. I think the waiver policy could have been possibly better designed so that states had real choices between things they could do to get out of No Child Left Behind. So, and in terms of competition, I think competition to a certain extent is a good thing. I think we want to do better for our kids. It's when that we are competing for resources that I think it becomes a challenge, right? So competition to do better for our kids, I am all for. Competition around sort of dollars and cents and where they go, I think that's a bigger challenge. So
Just add that Tennessee was one of the first 2 winners of Race to the Top, and I think it was key in galvanizing people across the state, educators, policymakers from across the state to come together and create a real vision for education, and it was the foundation of all the work that happened, and that was, I think, the right role for the federal government to set a context and then for the state to take it and run with it and say this is what we think needs to be true, and it led to real change on the ground there.
Do you want to comment on that? Or not?
30 seconds, and we take the last question. Just, I think the legitimate policy debate is how much federal money and state money, local money should be formula versus trying to incentivize change. And just a point of fact, Race to the Top was $4 billion over 4 years, 5 years, which sounds like a lot of money. As a nation, we spend $650 billion each year. So relative to the pie of K-12 funding, it's less than half of 1% of funding. And I think, again, legitimate conversation for all of us is how much money should be straight formula-based and how much should be trying to do breakthrough innovation stuff. And I have my own opinions, but I think there's an honest debate there. Last one in the back.
Hi, Rachel Fortune with America's Promise Alliance. We've made a lot of progress improving grad rates and closing gaps for key subgroups of students, but of course we have a lot of work to do, especially for low-income students, students with disabilities, students of color, and English language learners. Through the Grad Nation campaign, we're supporting states and communities to continue to do work to improve grad rates and other outcomes for students. So I'm wondering if you can comment on what you see as the greatest opportunities for states under ESSA to structure their accountability systems in ways that results in continued grad progress.
Yeah, I'm really focused on the requirement in ESSA that any high school with less than a 67% grad rate automatically falls in the bottom tier. I think that's something we negotiated, and I think it's something that's really important for high schools to look at. I also think the big progress on graduation is going to come from focusing on younger years. I just think we're sending too many kids into high school not ready for what they're going to experience there, and we're sending too many kids into college. We're just sort of continuing to pass kids through. So I think focusing and making sure that there are some gateways. So third grade reading policy, you can debate the sort of how you do it, but the idea that every kid should be able to read by the end of the third grade is something that I think we should all be able to stand for. I think there's a key point around 8th grade, 7th, 8th grade in mathematics where there's a certain skill set that you're going to need to be able to be successful in high school math. So I think those are two places where I think states could really lean in. The last thing I'll say is on the high school piece, we've got to get better at making sure that we're giving every kid every opportunity, but that we're customizing, especially in high school, to their next plans in life. Because where we lose kids is when we start telling them they have to take all these advanced academic courses when they don't see themselves in that way. And so we've got to help them change the way they see themselves so that they have the advanced academics, so that they do have a future. I'm not talking about tracking. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that some kids don't get the stuff that other kids do. What I am talking about is that we've got to give kids a pathway through this. We've got to help them understand what their future looks like. I think high schools are a place to lean in on in ESSA with those new requirements.
I think just 2 quick comments. I think first, improving the graduation rate is critically important, but so is what students are learning during that time and making sure that diploma signifies something meaningful. In Tennessee, I think one of the interesting things was we saw our graduation rate increase dramatically at the same time that we had also increased the requirements for graduation, and that was really exciting. One of the new requirements was for all students to take Algebra 2 as a course during high school, and some of our highest gains we saw on state assessments was on the Algebra 2 end of course assessment, even as more and more kids were taking it than in the past. So I think that's what you want to see, that both the requirement is meaningful and that more kids are meeting that bar. The second thing I would say is that in DC, one of the ways we're thinking about graduation rate under ESSA is looking not only at the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate, but also at 5- and 6-year graduation rates, particularly because we know that as much as we want our kids to be ready coming into high school, that's not the reality for all kids right now. So we do have some schools that are saying, look, if it's better for our students, we're going to take 5 years, and we're holding ourselves accountable, but we want to take that extra year because we think it's meaningful. So we think it's important to look at the 4-year ACGR, but also look at the extended ones.
I want to thank all of you for really, really thoughtful questions, and we have two, I think, amazing leaders that we're very, very fortunate to have fighting on behalf of kids locally and nationally. So please give our two panelists a huge round of applause. Thank you.